Welcome back, everybody, for another exciting edition of Western Civilization Part 1. Today we're going to be moving on and we're going to be talking about Rome, and particularly the Roman Republic. Our first section here is going to be on the foundations of Rome. And our focus question is going to be, what is a mixed constitution? And why did it serve Rome well? So grab a pen and paper, a laptop and keyboard, and we'll get going. First thing we want to do is we want to orient ourselves. Where the hell are we? We're in this Mediterranean world here. We had started off looking at the Middle East, which is just off the map here. We've talked extensively about Asia Minor here. Most recently, we've been focusing on Greece here. But today, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be moving into Italy, which is over here. Italy, of course, is very recognizable, a big boot-shaped peninsula, roughly 750 miles long. And it has a really great central location in the Mediterranean. If you'll remember, the Mediterranean was a gigantic highway of people and trade, and it was really the hub of the ancient world in the West. And Italy is really well situated because it's right in the middle of it, and it kind of like dips into it. So you can see it's not a bad place to start a civilization. If we look at the terrain of Italy, to the far north, up here, there's a mountain range. Let me get a color that you can actually see. Up here, not much better, up here is a mountain range called the Alps. This is a very high mountain range with peaks over 10,000 feet. And it acts as the northern border of Italy. North of Italy at this time was inhabited by Celtic and Germanic barbarians, very fierce people. And the Alps acted as kind of like a fence to keep these people out. And the Italians were very happy about that, I'm sure. In Italy itself, it has some nice broad plains. There's the Po Valley over here, northern Italy. The coast, the west coast of Italy, where Rome is, has a nice valley here. There are other valleys. So Italy is pretty green in many places. It has these great agricultural land. It's able to support a much larger population than Greece was, if you recall. Italy does have a mountain range that runs almost like a spine down the back of it. It's called the Apennine, and it runs right along Italy. It's high, but it's not impassable. So it's not impossible for the Italians to move back and forth and around. Okay, so it's going to be a bit easier to unify than Greece was. Early Italy was inhabited by a variety of different groups. To the far north were a group of people called the Celts. And this was the southernmost penetration of this particular culture. Now, the Celts were a wild, tribal, barbarian people at this particular time, and they actually inhabited most of Europe, all the way from Central Europe, what would be modern-day Poland, Czech Republic, all the way to Spain and Portugal. Today, they're best and most often associated with the Irish and the Scottish. If you're Irish or Scottish, or you know someone who's Irish or Scottish, they are of Celtic descent. But they inhabited northern Italy, and they were not really well liked by most of the other more civilized people in Italy. Now, just to the south of them was a very civilized people called the Etruscans. The Etruscans would have a big influence on the Romans. Many of the things that later Romans associated with themselves were actually Etruscan in origin. It's probably the Etruscans that taught the early Romans civilization, how to build cities. They were great engineers. The Romans would eventually borrow their alphabet off the Etruscans, so they exercised a big influence on Rome, and they're here in yellow. Now, to the center of Italy here, it's kind of this orange and pinkish color here. These were a group of people called the Samnites. And these people were also barbarian. They were hill people. If you remember the Apennines, those mountains, they inhabited here, not well liked by the Romans. To the south, in the boot of Italy here, the toe of Italy, were a group of people we're already familiar with. These were the Greeks, obviously fairly civilized and also exerting influence on the early Romans. Now, this area in red is going to be our biggest concern right over here. This is an area called Latinium. And this was inhabited by a group of tribes called the Latins. And these were Rome's cousins, so to speak. They all spoke a similar language, had a similar culture, worshiped similar gods. And of course, Rome was just one of the cities in Latinium, and Rome is right here. Okay, now that we have a understanding of the various peoples, let's zoom in on Rome in particular. Now, early Rome was located in a pretty strategic location. It's located on a river called the Tiber. And Rome's position on the Tiber gave it some advantages. The Tiber was navigable, that is, you could move a ship up it, up until about where Rome was. And so if you wanted to penetrate into Italy with a ship that was coming in from somewhere else in the Mediterranean, ships would come up the Tiber, but Rome was the last place that they could navigate up, because then it became too shallow. And so they would want to unload their cargo there. And so this was good for Rome. People would come there and load their cargo. It was also the location of an important bridgehead. People moving up and down the Italian peninsula would be forced to pass through Rome because, well, they would have to cross the Tiber, and one of the few places you could do it was in Rome. And so it gave it a good strategic location. Now, the terrain of early Rome was swampy with some mountaintops. So you can see the Tiber River running through the area here. And these mountaintops here is where the earliest inhabitants of what would later become Rome would inhabit. There's quite a bit of marshland that surrounds them, and the Romans would obviously much prefer to live on top of the hills. But in time, the Romans were able to fill in much of the marshland, and they were able to found their city, probably in the 7th or 8th century BC. The historic date given for the foundation of Rome is 753. That's the traditional date anyways. At this time, the Romans began to fill in some of the swamps and found their city. I've titled this little subsection Ab Urbe Condita, which means from the founding of the city, and oftentimes in Latin, this is what the Romans would say, Ab Urbe Condita, from the founding of the city, and by that they meant from 753 BC. Okay. Well, according to legend, the Romans had some legends about their origins. So according to legend, the Romans descended from a man by the name of Aeneas. Aeneas is a character that appears in the Iliad, that epic poem written by the Greek Homer. In this story, Aeneas is the only survivor of the Trojan Wars. Well, according to Roman legend, Aeneas, after surviving Troy, went on some travels around the Mediterranean. He traveled about, uh, got, went to Sicily, over here to Carthage, and eventually he settled in Rome. And there, or in the Latin territories anyways, not exactly in Rome, but in the Latin territories, and there he intermingled with the local Italian tribes, and he's regarded as the father of the Latins. Now, according to this legend, Aeneas had some offspring, and one of his offspring was a woman by the name of Rhea Silvia. And according to Roman legend, Rhea attracted the attention of the god Mars. And anytime in legends and any times in myths, if you attract the attention of a god, whether you're a male or a female, it usually doesn't turn out well for you. Well, Mars and Rhea had unconsensual sex, and Rhea became impregnated. And she gave birth to 2 baby boys. Unfortunately for the boys, Rhea's brother, who was the king of the Latins at this time, was jealous of them. And so he had the boys killed, or so he thought. He had a follower cast them into the river in order to drown them. Well, luck would have it that the boys survived and were suckled by a she-wolf, and then raised by a shepherd. In time, the 2 boys were able to grow, and the boys' names were Romulus and Remus. Now, according to the legend, the boys were able to defeat their evil uncle, and in time the boys quarreled amongst themselves. Romulus killed Remus and is regarded as the founder of Rome, and we've already talked about that. Supposedly he founded Rome in 753 and became its first king. Well, over the course of the next 200 years or so, the Romans, according to legend, were ruled by 7 kings. The last of these kings was called Tarquin the Proud. Why was he called Tarquin the Proud? Well, because he was kind of a jerk. And he did some things that upset the Roman upper class, like letting his son sleep with their wives and do all kinds of things that made him pretty unpopular. Well, eventually, the Roman upper class tired of his behavior, and they staged a revolt. And this revolt ultimately led to the overthrow of the kings and the founding of the Roman Republic. And this is another really important date in history. The date given for the founding of the Roman Republic is 510 BC. Well, having lived under the domination of kings for a long time, these upper class people wanted to create a system that was different. They wanted to create a system in which they could participate and not be dominated by one person. And so the Romans created a new political system, which later historians called a mixed constitution. Now, the Roman system of government was the marvel of the ancient world and would later attract the attention of many Greeks. Now, according to the Greeks, their experience with history was one of revolution. The Greeks believed that all governments would essentially would be cyclical. At some point in their history, they would be monarchies, and they would be ruled by one man. In time, the upper classes would tire of this individual's behavior, and they would overthrow the monarch and share the prizes of government among themselves, and it would become an aristocracy. We're here now. But in time, the aristocracy would grow corrupt, and the people would not be able to tolerate their behavior anymore, and it would become a democracy. But in time, the democracy would become corrupt and would degenerate into mob rule, and a monarch would come, a strong man would arise and put an end to it, and the whole cycle would occur over and over again. And Greek history had kind of borne this out. During the early days of the Greeks, they were ruled by kings. Then during the Archaic Age, they had become an aristocracy. During classical Greek times, the people had risen up and they had become a democracy. You think of Athens in its democratic age. During the crisis of the 4th century, the Greeks had degenerated, and there was mob rule and all kinds of hardship. You may remember that. And then Philip of Macedon came in, put the smack down, and it was back to monarchy. Well, anyways, the Greeks believed that all of history would be a continuous cycle like this. But the Romans, they thought, had proved them wrong, because the Romans created a system of government that incorporated the best of each system. The Roman system of government had a monarchical element to it, it had an aristocratic element to it, and it had a democratic element to it. And this system of government seemed to work very well. It had checks and balances to it. In order for the system to run, you needed all three different groups working together. And to the Greeks, they said, well, this is why the Romans are so successful, because they created this very stable system of government that gives all these different groups in society some say, and they have balance. So let's take a look at this in a little bit more detail. And we'll start with this top group, the monarchical group. Well, the Romans didn't have kings, but what they had is they had people called magistrates. After removing the kings, the Roman upper class decided that they didn't want to be ruled by one person. Rather, they wanted to have the offices of government spread out among different groups of people. Part of this was so that they could all participate and have a turn and get a chance at being the special person for a while, and part of it was so that they could fragment power so not one person had it. Well, the most important office in the Roman system were the consuls, pictured here. The consuls were like the commanders-in-chief of the army. That was their primary duty. They would be the ones who would lead and call armies together. The consuls also had important duties inside Rome itself. They were the ones, and the only ones, who could call together a group of Romans to meet as part of their assembly. We'll look at the assembly in just a second. Now, the Romans, as I said, they wanted to spread power out as much as possible, and to avoid one person from getting too much power. And so part of their system of government was that consuls and other magistrates were limited in the amount of time that they could stay in office. You were only allowed to stay in office for 1 year, and then you were expected to step down and give someone else a term. The Romans were also concerned that giving one person control even for 1 year might be dangerous. And so they instituted a system with their magistrates where they would always have at least one colleague. So there were always two consuls, and one colleague was given veto power over the other. And so the hope was, by giving them veto power, they could stop some megalomaniac, some power-hungry person from assuming too much control. There were other offices, though, and the Romans would think of their magistracies as kind of a course you would go up. As a young man, you would be allowed to be a quaestor or a treasurer. And once you'd had some experience, and again, you would only be a quaestor for 1 year, you would then be eligible to run for another office. You could become an aedile, and you would take care of temples and streets. And as you got older and you got more experience, then you could run for praetor or judge. Praetors could also command armies in a pinch if they needed to. Finally, when you were older, the age of 40, you could become a consul, and you would be old enough and wise enough, hopefully, to lead an army. And this was called the course of honors. The idea is you'd get experience at a lower level and then move up. And the Romans loved their honors. They loved their offices. And so it was a big deal for upper-class Romans to go and hold these various positions at different times in their lives. An interesting fact about the Roman constitution is that they also had a provision in it that in times of crisis, they could invoke the office of dictator. So say two consuls were dead and there was no one to lead the army and the enemies were at the gates. Occasionally, they would invoke this office, the office of dictator. And as dictator, you were given unlimited powers, but only for 6 months until the crisis had passed. Obviously, the Romans didn't like to use this office, though, because, well, dangerous to give people unlimited powers. Well, aside from the magistrates who had executive functions, monarchical functions, if you will, Romans also had an aristocratic element to it. And in the aristocratic element of the Roman constitution was known as the Senate. And to be in the Senate, you had to be an ex-office holder. So once you were consul, once you were a praetor, one of these higher offices, when your term was done, what did you do? Well, if you weren't running for office again, you were allowed to sit in the Senate. And so the Senate was made up of ex-judges and ex-generals. And so they were considered wise, experienced, usually older men. Now, the Senate in Rome had a couple of duties. One of their duties was to debate and to talk about things. And once they would debate and come up with a resolution, they would offer an opinion. And because the Senate was so respected in Rome, this opinion would usually become law, although the Senate never did pass laws on its own. It would just give opinions, and these opinions would normally become law. The Senate also handled the finances of Rome, and they directed foreign policy. Having so many generals and judges in there, consuls would often defer to the Senate's opinion on foreign policy. And so they were a really important group and powerful. Well, as we mentioned, the Romans also had a democratic element to their constitution. And these were the popular assemblies. Any Roman citizen, male citizen, over the age of 14 was allowed to attend the popular assemblies. They would meet in the Campus Martius, this big open plain in Rome, and they would debate. Well, they wouldn't debate, but they would pass resolutions there. Now, In the Roman system, the assembly could only meet if called. Well, who would call an assembly? If you're paying attention, you would remember that only the consuls could do that. And so the consuls would make it known that they wanted to have an assembly of the Romans, and then only the consuls could address the assembly. And so the assembly would be called, the consul would propose a resolution, usually something that the Senate had proposed to them, and then the Romans could vote on it, but they were only allowed to vote yes or no. They were not allowed to make amendments to it or to add items to it. They could vote yes or no. And it was only the Roman assembly that could pass a law. So if the consul and the Senate wanted to do something, it wasn't a law until the Roman people themselves voted on it. In addition to pass laws, it was the assembly who would elect the magistrates. And so no magistrate could become a magistrate unless the Roman people themselves had elected them. And so this, in a nutshell, is the way the Roman system worked. Now, if you're a little confused about this, the Roman system looks something like this on paper. Generally, what would happen would be that the Senate over here, they would debate something, and they would make their opinion known to the consuls and just give their opinion out. They'd let the assembly know, well, this is what we think. Generally, the consul would then propose the law to the assembly. Now, the assembly could accept this, or they could reject it. Oftentimes, they would accept it if the Senate thought it was a good idea. And then it would be passed, and it would become a law. And so you needed all three of these groups to cooperate in order to make a law. Once a law, though, who's going to enforce it? Well, either the consuls or one of the other magistrates would enforce the law. They were the ones who would execute the law, which is why they're called the executive branch. And so many in the ancient world marveled at this Roman constitution, which gave all these different elements in society a voice, and which prevented one group from gaining power at the expense of the other. And as we're going to see, this constitution would serve the Romans for about 500 years and enable them to take over basically the entire known world at that time. Okay, what I'd like you to do now is to arrange your notes, get them together, and think about this focus question. What is a mixed constitution, and why did it serve Rome well?